So we're sitting down with Jackie Fraser, transplant recipient, double lung from Busselton in Western Australia. Jackie, thanks for taking the time.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I just thought we'd start with maybe if you could run us through a bit about your history leading up to transplant, life before.
Okay, so I was born with cystic fibrosis. I was diagnosed when I was just a day old. I had to have part of my bowel removed, and that is one of the main symptoms of cystic fibrosis when a baby is born. So I lived with CF my whole life, always been, unwell and sick and very used to taking medications and doing treatments every day, and that kind of thing. Over the years, the outcome for CF is generally a lung transplant. So you kind of always have that in the back of your mind as someone growing up with CF. That's not something that's a shock for us. You're always sort of thinking that that's somewhere in the future. I didn't think it would be before I was 30. I really wasn't probably prepared for that. But my health started to, I was pretty well as a kid, just one hospital stint each year for a couple of weeks was generally how my health went. And then as it started to progress and my lungs got more damage, the hospital stays started creeping up a few more per year. And it probably got to, I was having IV antibiotics 3 times, 4 times a year.
Right, yeah.
And my
Quite,
lungs,
quite a
yeah,
bit.
my lungs
Yeah.
were doing pretty bad.
Yeah.
And my lung function kept declining and declining until I got influenza A. It was bird flu.
Right.
And yeah, that
Where did you pick that up? Any idea?
no idea. No
Right.
idea. It was right before my hens
Mm.
party, which we had to cancel, and I was the sickest I've ever been in my life. Like I was not sleeping. I don't know if my body was stopping me from sleeping because I was so unwell and my lungs were so like in such poor shape
Yeah.
that a few times I was scared that I wasn't going to wake up.
Oh,
Um,
horrible, horrible.
yeah, it was really, really scary time. So I ended up going to emergency, and they did a few tests and things, and it came back that I had influenza A, which has a couple of strains. And the strain I had was bird flu. So pretty much the worst flu you can get.
Hectic.
Um, yeah, and my lung function just dropped like another 10%. So I think at this point I was sitting around maybe 20-25% lung capacity. Um, but we had to get married. So we'd had this whole wedding planned. It was overseas in Bali. So I was sort of doing my best to get better. This was just a few weeks before we were supposed to fly out, and I was
Right.
still in hospital, and it was a really wild time. And I had lost all this weight, so I was stressed that my wedding dress was going to be too big, and there was a lot happening. But in the end, I had 3 weeks in hospital, and I was better-ish by the end of it. My lungs were still in pretty poor shape, but the team was happy for me to leave the country, go get married, that sort of thing. And I was pretty unwell during the whole wedding, just really exhausted, struggling to breathe, that kind of thing. Um, we cut our honeymoon short because I was getting fevers and
Yeah.
not doing well. And we're in a third world country. We weren't game to go to the hospital, that sort of
Yeah.
thing. So just cut the trip short, flew home, and we got home and my lung function was only 16%.
Right.
Um, and I pretty much just didn't really recover from there. So I ended up on oxygen 24/7, using a BiPAP machine at night to keep my airways open. And that was just our new normal. But we had a trip planned to go traveling in our camper trailer with our dog. We already had someone living in our house, so we couldn't really just go home because now I'm on oxygen. So we decided to go ahead with our trip with oxygen in tow.
Good on you.
Yeah, it was, I feel like it was one of the best ways we could have dealt with that. The doctors were talking about transplant. That was the first time that transplant had come up. And they wanted to list me right then and there. So I didn't really get, most CF patients sort of get a bit of a year or so to prepare. You know, they will catch up with them and say, look, you're heading towards transplant. Let's do this and this over the next year and see if you can avoid it, but that's the direction you're going. I didn't really get that because it all happened so fast. And we weren't ready for the transplant at that point. I definitely wasn't. And we had this trip planned and we thought, look, let's just go ahead with the trip and see what happens. We had plans to come back for a wedding halfway through the trip. So the agreement was to do antibiotics then, IV antibiotics for the 2 weeks we were home, and then go back on the trip. We did telehealth appointments the whole way along, and, you know, I had my lung function checked. So if there was any like rapid decline, we would just hightail it home and jump on the list and get the transplant done. But at this point, I was sort of remaining stable. We were living a great life. We travelled up all the way to Broome, lived in Broome for a few months. We got to avoid winter, which I think was a really good idea for where my lungs were at. I think another flu would have killed me. So we just stayed in the sun, went to the beach, like hung out with our dog. Yeah, it was a struggle putting the camper trailer up and down every few days. But we managed. My poor husband had to keep on top of all our solar power because that's what was charging my oxygen.
That would add a bit of extra pressure.
Yeah, he's got like PTSD from beeping now. Like any beeps, he's like, oh. So that was a bit of a wild time for us, but it was great. I think like getting out there and doing that was way better than us just sitting at home and thinking about, you know, transplant and what could happen. And, you know, we had some really good conversations sitting on the beach in the sun, you know, talking about what might happen. And I just think if we had have done that year any different, I don't know if we would have coped with the reality that we were being faced with. So we did that trip.
I mean, I've interviewed a fair few people now, and that's probably the best transplant preparation I've ever heard. That's fantastic. And like, that takes a certain type of person to be able to push that aside and go, you know what, I'm going for this. So yeah, that's great. Fantastic.
Yeah, we just thought we'll give it a go. We were like totally prepared to turn around and come home if we needed to. And we knew, you know, Broome was further enough that if we had to, we could drive to Perth in 24 hours. And be there if we needed to. I had backup antibiotics. I did that stint of IVs in the middle. So yeah, there were some people that were like, are you guys doing the right thing? But I think we just knew that for us, that was the best option. And we made some really amazing memories. I went swimming with whale sharks. And just like left my oxygen on the boat and jumped in snorkeling. Like we did it was a really good year. In 2020, in September, we decided to commit to transplant, and I was officially listed. And then in 2 months, I got my call.
That's awesome.
And now, yeah, 2.5 years later, here we are.